I was playing around with the PlayStation Vita over the weekend and looking at the different homebrew and emulators on that system. And one of the emulators is a N64 emulator known as Daedalus X64, which was based on an earlier emulator that was developed for the PSP. And while it does run a few games okay, when I launched, I would say some of the more deeper cuts, when I launched the game The World Is Not Enough, the emulation was broken. And when you look at the game, it runs too fast. There is a serious amount of graphical issues, and it's just unplayable. Now, in theory, the PlayStation Vita should be able to emulate a Nintendo 64, but it struggles, and the compatibility list isn't great. Now, I also went back to test Nintendo 64 emulation in general using Batocera, and this is running on my Raspberry Pi 5 with 8GB of RAM on board. Now, this is running with a moderate overclock at 2.6 GHz, and the results are all over the place. Of course, many of what I would consider the big popular games like Mario 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Star Fox 64, Mario Kart 64, Banjo-Kazooie all run pretty well, and most people won't even realize this. But if you dig a little deeper into the Nintendo 64 library, that's where the problems start to show. And rather than just pressing the start button to get into game knowing that you'll get a good experience every single time, in some instances I had to play a cat and mouse game, tweaking various settings, changing plugins, until I could find a good balance of performance versus quality. And even when I was able to do this, it was very apparent that some emulation issues still existed. Now, Nintendo 64 emulation has been difficult to get right pretty much from the jump. Achieving 100% near compatibility with good performance and no graphical issues, no stutter, no audio issues just doesn't seem attainable. And the question really is why? Why is this the case? Now, this is definitely not a video where I'm, talking about the lack of progress when it comes to Nintendo 64 emulation. Rather, it's for those people that may be confused as to why it's still very difficult to emulate a Nintendo 64 in 2025, even though we have powerful hardware these days that really should be more than capable of handling the job. Now, when the Nintendo 64 released, it represented a giant leap forward in technology, and developers could write what is known as microcode to get more power and customize the N64 experience to their games. Now, one of the best examples of custom microcode has to be Factor 5 and their port of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine on the Nintendo 64. Now, the game runs at 640 by 480 stock on the PC. And in order to get the same level of fidelity and performance, Factor 5 decided that they would not only use the expansion pack, but more importantly, they would design their own custom microcode in order to make the game run as optimal as possible. And this microcode featured real-time lighting effects because the supplied ones that came from Nintendo and Silicon Graphics simply weren't good enough. Now, back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, computers weren't fast enough to run cycle-accurate Nintendo 64 emulations. So in order to solve for this, they took a high-level emulation or HLE approach. And this basically solved problems as they came up on individual games. So rather than targeting Nintendo 64 emulation itself as an architecture or at the machine level, the emulation was tailored more around making specific games work by replacing individual function calls with the emulated equivalents. And this meant that the games that were supported ran very fast and they were quite compatible. But unfortunately, this meant that compatibility as a whole, when we talk about the entire selection of the Nintendo 64 library, was not really that compatible at all. We have to remember that during the early days of the Nintendo 64 emulation scene, there was a lot of guesswork and discovery that was done to understand how to effectively emulate microcode. Many games would use standard microcode that was provided by Nintendo, but many other games were programmable in order to achieve the certain results that the games were looking for. And because the Nintendo 64 is effectively a programmable architecture, it made it near impossible to achieve a high level of compatibility. And even when games were starting to boot when the microcode was implemented correctly, Then other issues quickly arose, including texture filtering issues, because the Nintendo 64 samples 3 points instead of 4. This meant that visible seams could be apparent. Not only this, the Nintendo 64's powerful frame buffer is an area that many early emulators struggled with. But I think it's fair to say that in the last 10 years or so, these particular issues have been addressed and solved for. Now, the other thing that Nintendo 64 and indeed PlayStation 1 emulators introduced back in the day was the concept of plugins. Now, when emulators were developed, the emulation authors would expose an API and allow other developers to come in and build out the functionality to emulate the graphic subsystems, the audio processing, the controller inputs, and these things were either done internally or left to other developers. And you could basically build your own plugins to drop into these particular emulators. Now, this particular plugin spec was known as Zilmar. Now, Zilmar is one of the original developers of Project 64, and the plugin spec was effectively named after them. Now, this Zilmar specification exposes a common API for developers to build their plugins to use on the original emulator that supported it, known as Project 64. Now, other emulators also support the Zilmar spec, including Mupen 64, 1964, and other early Nintendo 64 emulators. Now, at the time, having access to different plugins was a good thing more than a bad thing. Good in that if your game didn't run quite right with one plugin, you could simply switch over to another one, say the Rise plugin, which may be more up-to-date and accurate and would fix the problem. The problem, however, with the plugin spec is that it's out of date. It's been extended to what is now known as the Mupen Plus specification, which opens up more functions that can be used in more modern emulation, and emulators such as the Mupen Plus emulator, as well as Simple 64, all adhere to the updated plugin specification. Now, developers that built these plugins would work tirelessly to fix all sorts of graphical issues that they would uncover. And unfortunately, fixing one issue could break several other games. And this is just the way things are. And this is the problem with high-level emulation solutions. And as a result, Nintendo 64 emulation suffered over the years. And as mentioned, many of the heavy-hitter N64 games, the best like 20 or 30 games, mostly run very well out of the box, even with HLE plugins on lower spec machines. But once you move out of that comfort zone and get into some of the deeper cut games, that's where the problems start to appear. The plugin system, in my opinion, simply has no place in modern emulation in 2025. And if you take a look at something like DuckStation and PCSX2, a lot of refactoring has been done to do away with the entire plugin system on PlayStation 1 emulation. And Nintendo 64, if it is to advance to a new frontier, then we must do away with this concept. Original HLE plugins is what started things out, but as PC machines and devices became faster and GPUs became cheaper and more advanced, it started to become possible to write cycle-accurate emulation via LLE or low-level emulation. Now, because GPUs started to support compute shaders, it meant that supporting these asynchronous lines of compute allowed for real-time execution of the Nintendo 64 RDP with very good accuracy. Now, the first plugin that was developed was known as Angry Lion, and this was developed back in 2010 and was a game changer for many. The problem was it ran terribly slow. Now, in recent times, the Parallel RDP plugin was developed that runs using Vulkan and allows for a much more optimized level of compute. It also allows for internal upscaling, and this plugin is what is used in two of the best, most accurate Nintendo 64 emulators around, known as Simple 64 and Ares. But you do need a powerful computer to run these emulators well. Take, for example, this Beelink Mini S12 PC. Now, this is a mini PC that has 8GB of DDR4 RAM and an Intel Alder Lake N95. It has 4 cores up to 3.4 GHz. Now, on paper, this sounds like more than enough overhead to emulate the Nintendo 64. But as you can see here, Simple 64 with the Parallel RDP plugin can't hit 60 FPS at all. So what hope is there for accurate N64 emulation on lower and mid-spec systems like a Raspberry Pi 5 or an Ambinic handheld. The common practice is to use an HLE plugin known as Glide N64. Now this is a pretty good RDP plugin and has a high level of compatibility for games, and it's the standard choice for many. One of the major areas where Glide N64 is used by many is with its texture replacement functionality. And this allows many Nintendo 64 games to look a lot better than they were originally intended, simply by replacing textures with higher resolution versions, enhancing the overall visuals of a Nintendo 64 game, which in many cases can look quite blurry and quite anti-aliased. And then we need to talk about the Nintendo Switch Online service that runs Nintendo 64 games. After a rough start, most people accept these days that the NSO service is pretty decent. And we just said that a high level of CPU power is required to emulate a Nintendo 64 accurately. On face value, the NSO service appears to run almost every game well, but if you look a bit deeper, problems become quickly apparent. In order to get more performance, it's obvious that the emulation has resorted to timing hacks and various other hacks to get games running faster than intended. And many have misreported this as some type of enhancement. The problem here is that many games that were developed for the Nintendo 64 are inherently tied to the frame rate, which causes many issues. Pilotwings 64 and F-Zero X are examples of where the clocks in the game go out of sync and cause gameplay issues. And this is just one issue with the NSO service. If you're not really sure what you're looking for, you'll never notice this. But if you are someone that has come from the Nintendo 64 original hardware, then you'll quickly realize that things aren't running as well as they might. So this is all very doom and gloom sounding. Is there any hope for N64 emulation to improve at all? Well, yes, of course. As mentioned, with faster processing, advancements in GPU technology, more compute, handhelds such as the Steam Deck and ROG Ally, these are very powerful devices. And this is enough horsepower to play many Nintendo 64 games with a high level of accuracy and compatibility. The problem is many cheaper handhelds and these all-in-one solutions have many legacy issues emulating the Nintendo 64. My Raspberry Pi 5, for example, runs most things decently enough, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who just wants to sit down and enjoy the library. In many ways, the best and most convenient way to play N64 games is to just buy original hardware. It's still relatively cheap, and with a flash cartridge like an EverDrive or a Summer 64 and either an internal HDMI mod or a cheap upscaling solution, you can play the entire suite of games, including all homebrew demos, just as they were intended. But what about FPGA? Is FPGA the savior of all things N64 emulation? FPGA is impressive technology, especially when we're talking about the Nintendo 64. But it's a false assertion to say that FPGA technology, especially for the Nintendo 64, is offering 100% compatibility. The Mr. FPGA core is very impressive and can boot the entire library of commercial games, but it can't boot any homebrew games that were developed with LibDragon, an open source SDK. And of course, all this homebrew can boot on real hardware and even some emulators. In order for N64 FPGA core to run on the Mr., some adjustments were made for performance. Timing-related issues and other graphical issues still exist. The Analog 3D by Analog is said to be 100% compatible with the entire commercial library of games, but you can be sure once we get one here on my test bench, I'm pretty confident that I can debunk this claim. Now, there's also been another push to let reverse engineering, decompilation and recompilation of Nintendo 64 binaries into C source code and being able to be recompiled on the PC is one of the most exciting prospects when it comes to preserving the Nintendo 64 library, but also enhancing them for modern PCs and game consoles. We saw Majora's Mask recently at the end of 2024. Star Fox also released its recompilation project known as Starship, and this is a much bigger topic that I'm planning to cover in 2025. So do I think Nintendo 64 emulation will ever get better? I do think it will, and it's really going to kind of come down to who is going to be really the pioneers of basically just separating the old legacy stuff and moving N64 emulation into a new generation. And if we take a look at an emulator such as DuckStation or PCSX2, they've been completely refactored from the ground up to offer an experience where the entire machine architecture is emulated with a very high level of accuracy. Now, it took a very long time for both of these emulators to get to where they are, but there's really no reason why the Nintendo 64 couldn't do the same thing. We're seeing some strides being made towards this with emulators such as Simple 64 and Ares, and unfortunately, in my opinion, Nintendo 64 emulation is kind of going to remain stagnant for a little bit longer yet until we start to see some breakthroughs in that particular space. But hey, these are just my thoughts and opinions. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on Nintendo 64 emulation in the comments below. And if you did like this episode, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.